So an issue I have always had is wondering what's a better exercise for the vertical jump. And I would always compare the squat, whether it's a front squat or a back squat, versus a deadlift. And this is taking out the trap bar deadlift, because the trap bar deadlift is kind of a mix of the two. But I always looked at this, how a vertical jump looks when you're doing a dunk or when you're doing an approach vertical. And your torso is fairly upright, and then you're exploding upwards and you're going into your jump. So you're using a lot of like ankle dorsiflexion. And it actually looks very similar to a squat pattern. It does not really look like a deadlift pattern, because a deadlift, you're pretty like hunched over. Not that you're rounded at the back, but your torso is just a lot more bent forward. Like your hips are hinging a lot more. So I would always say like the squat is better for vertical jump. The deadlifts doesn't have much transfer in my head, because the specifics, it didn't really make sense. But actually, if you look at a standing vertical jump, in my case, and in a lot of the best jumpers' cases, so the arms are up sometimes, they throw the arms down, and then they come up, but there's a pretty big hip hinge, and it looks very similar to a deadlift. It looks more similar to a deadlift than it does look to a squat. So in the standing vertical jump, it's a little bit different than the approach and the dunking, but there's still a little bit of that hip hinge action happening in both of the movements, just more so in the standing. So if we look at that from like a muscular level, it's you're like, well, what's really happening there? Well, the glutes are getting stretched a lot, and the glutes are extending upwards. But also the spinal erectors are able to extend the torso, like violently at the top. So we can take this and say, especially for the standing vertical jump, if you have weak spinal erectors, you're probably limiting your vertical jump. In the standing, where you have a big hip hinge, but probably also in the action of dunking and in the action of an approach vertical, because there's always a little bit of that forward bend. So the squat, when you do a typical squat, a front squat, back squat, whether it's high bar or low bar, sure, you're going to build the spinal erectors because you're kind of loading the spine, but I think a lot better exercise is the deadlift to strengthen the spinal erectors, like strengthen them a lot, and more so than like a good morning or a back extension exercise too, which kind of target that. But you can't use a ton of weight with the back extension, and you're not going to use a ton of weight with a good morning. At least I don't really recommend you do, because they're kind of awkward exercises. But the deadlift, you can load super heavy and strengthen your spinal erectors a lot more than all of these other movements. So the deadlift is not a bad exercise for vertical jump. It might just not look as specific in the dunking and approach vertical, but it's a lot more specific in my mind to the standing vertical. And actually, if you want to like bridge the gap of the two, again, you could go to the trap bar deadlifts, and that's going to look very similar to a vertical jump. So yeah, that's a mistake I made, is thinking that the deadlift was fairly useful or useless to develop vertical jump, but I think it's pretty useful. I'm just a person that has always deadlifted. Like my deadlift stays around 600 pounds. So my spinal erectors are pretty strong, but there are athletes that do not have strong spinal erectors. A lot of athletes, actually a lot of basketball athletes who really value jumping, have very weak spinal erectors. So hey man, like, get stronger with the deadlift. And if you don't want to get stronger with the deadlift because of discomfort or whatever reason, a trap bar deadlift is also a pretty good exercise. So that's all I got for you. Hopefully that tip helps. Kind of a mistake I've made in the past, and I think something that is kind of clearing up in my head with time, that the deadlift is a pretty awesome exercise. And if your limitation is these spinal erectors, because they're weak, or you just don't really train them, get your deadlift up, and you'll probably see some gain in your vertical jump, especially your standing vertical jump.